Hey, how's it going? Keith Morgan here for TechTyro.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at the interface for Blender. So this is going to be our first Blender tutorial, and if you do not have Blender, what it is a 3D modeling program that is open source, free to public, and you can use it for pretty much any purpose. You can download Blender via the software links tab on our website, or by going to blender.org and following the download tab. We also recommend that you keep your eyes out for updates, as Blender is constantly revised and new features are constantly added. And there's plenty of bug fixes as well, so you should also keep that up to date, as we will be exploring the new features as they are released. And we'll also want to remind you to download your free Blender shortcut cards via the Downloads tab on our website, so you can keep all of the shortcuts in your head, and so you don't need to keep referencing a video or a blog or anything. So, with that, let us get into Blender. So at the time of this recording, we are using Blender 2.65. And when you open Blender for the first time, you'll see this splash screen. And you can just click to get rid of that. Now, at first you'll see you have your workspace with a default cube. And we're not going to touch that right now. This tutorial is strictly on getting to know approximately where everything is. So the first thing we're going to do is set up our user preferences. So to do that, we'll go up to the top here and choose File, User Preferences. And we're just going to be setting some of the settings we'll be using commonly. And we'll be saving that as a default so that every time you open Blender, they are already set up. So a good one to start with is your undo states. This will eat a lot of RAM if you set it really high, but you know, we could probably get away with 64 for most computers. And next we'll go to the Input tab, and we'll turn on Continuous Grab. And we won't necessarily see that in this tutorial, but if you don't use it, you'll definitely notice you're going to be spending some time doing certain things. And we'll also emulate the third mouse button for those of us on laptops or without a proper mouse. And when you activate Emulate Third Mouse Button, where you would use a middle mouse button, you would hold Alt and then left click and drag. For example, if I were to minimize this quickly and go to our viewport, to do a basic orbit around in the viewport, you would hold the middle mouse button and click it and then drag around. But what emulating middle mouse button does is if I hold Alt and then I left click, I do the exact same thing. So it's very handy and you'll be wanting to use that. So we'll just bring up our user preferences again. And next we'll go to the add-ons tab. And under here, we have a bunch of plugins we can enable that will just increase our productivity or give us new features that we'll be exploring in future tutorials. So the first one we want is to go to the Add Mesh function, and we will enable the Ant Landscape, the Bolt Factory, Extra Objects, and Regular Solids. You could also enable Pipe Joints, but you know, that's another day. And then we'll also go down to the Object options, and we'll enable Cell Fracture and Fracture Tools. Lastly, we'll go to the Systems tab, and over here under Compute Device, if you have this option for CUDA, click it. What this does is if you have an NVIDIA graphics card with CUDA cores, you will be able to use your GPU for rendering in the Blender Cycles renderer. And what that does is it just speeds up the process immensely. You can still, like if you don't have this option, you know, you're fine. You can use your CPU to use that renderer. It'll just take a lot longer. So you're not out of the water per se, but you know, you have a little bit of a disadvantage. So with that, we can hit Save as Default. And these are now our defaults. And likewise, if we just go up to File and then save the user settings, just to be safe, every time we open Blender, all those presets and settings will all be enabled. Now, here's our basic project. We can go up to the File tab and we can save it. I'm not going to right now, but if you wanted to, by all means. And this is where we can also access the new file function. If you click that, you can reload your startup file, which, as you can see, it has reset. Likewise, we also have our open options, which you can use if you are continuing a project. Next to the file, we have the add menu, and this is where you'll be adding all of your objects to your scene. And so the main ones you'll be using are under Mesh, and these are your primitives. And as you can see down here, by looking at this plugin icon, we can see that these are the plugins we enabled earlier. So if you look under here, if we add a landscape, it would add a landscape. If we added a bolt, it would add the bolt factory plugin. Under extra objects, we have a number of useful objects, including teapots and steps and all that good stuff. And under solids, we have Platonic solids, Archimedean solids, Catalian solids. You know, very handy. And if you want to access the add menu very quickly, you can, instead of going up here, just hit Shift A, and then it pops up. Over here on the left, we have our tool shelf. If it is not showing right now, you can enable it by going to View and Tool Shelf, or as you can see right there, we have the shortcut for T, so that will toggle the tool shelf. And we'll also hit N, which will bring up our properties panel on the right here. And if those ever go missing, you know, just look at just enable them. And if you forget your shortcuts, either reference the Blender manual, your Blender shortcut cards, or go under here for View and just enable it under Properties. Along the bottom here, we have our timeline. And this won't really show anything right now as we don't have anything animated. But if you scrub through here, you can see that the frame number I am on changes. And these two values here dictate your start frame value and your end frame value. So if we were to change our end frame value to, say, 100, you'll see that our timeline gets shrunk in as the duration of our timeline is shortened from 250 frames to 100 frames. So now our animation would only be 100 frames long. You can also play your animation by hitting the play button right there or using the shortcut Alt-A. Over on the right here, we have more properties. And then these are broken up into multiple subtabs. And if we just hover our mouse over here, we can expand it out so we can see a little bit more. But our first one is our render tab. These are the settings you'll choose when you go to export a file when you're done doing all of your work. So your main things you'll be playing with are the resolution and frame rate, which by default should be 24 frames per second. And depending what renderer you're using, like for example, up here at the top you can see we're using Blender Render. You'll have a certain set of settings. For example, under the Layers tab, you'll see we have all of these settings for the different render layers you can enable. Don't worry about this so much, I'm just showing you the difference. But if we go up here and we change it to Cycles Render, you'll see we lose that Layer tab up here, but it goes down here, and we don't have as many options as before. But these are all just specific to the renderer. So, you know, if things go missing on you, just look around. You may have just switched a renderer engine. That may just be your issue. And likewise, while we're still in Cycles, you can see right here that we have our device for the render. And for those of us that are able to enable our CUDA cores, you can change your device from CPU to GPU, and that will just enable your render, or while you're rendering, to use your GPU to render your image, and it will be much faster, as I have said. Under here, we have our output folder, and by default, it just sends it to your temp folder on your computer. But if you want to set it to a custom location, you hit this little file function, and then you can go and navigate to where you want. So I'll just say the desktop for now. We'll skip these first two tabs. Your fourth tab here is your object tab, and this gives us transformation data and display options for the object. So, you know, we can enable the name, and if we look over here, it now has its name on the object. It'll also show us what its current location, rotation, and scale is in Euclidean space, that is X, Y, and Z space. You can tell your axes by looking down here at this gimbal, which shows the X, Y, and Z axes as red, green, and blue respectively. And the object itself also has a gimbal which shows the axes. The arrows point in the positive direction on the axis. So as you can see right now, the arrow is on this side of the object, so this is pointing towards the positive side. But because we've crossed the 0 point in the middle here, if you look over here, its location is -3 on the Y. And it's just important to keep track of where you are in 3D space, especially if you're setting up a camera or you have objects moving in specific axes. We'll skip this fifth tab, and we'll go over to the next one. This is our modifier tab, and you will be spending quite a bit of time in here. What modifiers are certain parameters and effects you can add to an object that will change its geometry and or its physics, depending if you choose a simulation. And so, for example, let's say we'll select our cube here, and we will add a subdivision surface modifier. And you can see what a subdivision surface modifier does is it subdivides each face, and in the process it also smooths out and averages out the distance between those faces. So if I were to put the view here to 2, you can see it gets even smoother. And you can leave it unapplied, and you will be able to edit it as long as it's left right there. Or you can apply it, and it is permanently set like that. If you ever want to undo anything, you can just hit Control Z, or Control Z rather. And if you want to redo, you go Control Shift Z. And if you want to see your entire undo state, you can go Control Alt Z, and you can choose from this history. You can only go as far back as your states allow. But, you know, if you're working efficiently and you're not screwing up and you're saving often, that should not be an issue. So, the last tab we'll look at today is our Materials tab. And I'll switch over to Blender Render right now for our render engine, just so you can see a bit of what this looks like. So what Blender renders material, or what the internal renderers materials engine lets you do, is create your materials, and it gives you this this preview here that shows you how the light will interact and how the surface will look. It also gives you a few objects for you to preview the different looks of each material. Just pick whichever one suits whatever shape your object closely fits, and that can give you a more accurate representation of how the light will interact with your material. And you can play around with these settings. The diffuse is the flat color, the main color of your object. The specular is the color of the highlights. So let's just demonstrate that. We'll change our diffuse to red, and we'll change our specular to green. And as you can see, our diffuse color has been changed to red, and our specular has become green. If I just increase the intensity, it'll be a little more green, but it is also mixing with the red underneath. That's why it looks a little bit yellow. And we also have shading options, transparency options. If you use transparency or mirror options, you'll have to check this box before you can enable those to render. And if we increase the mirror, you can see our material becomes reflective. And just a quick setup on how to navigate around your viewport before we finish up. To move around your viewport, as we said earlier, you can use your middle mouse button to orbit around your objects. You can use Shift and middle mouse button to pan around your scene. You can use the middle mouse button itself just to scroll in and out. If you hit 0 on your number pad, you can go to your camera view. If you hit 1, you can go to front view mode. And if you're not sure what mode you're in, or what view you're in when you hit a number pad button, or when you change your view via the number pad, if you look up here in the top, it gives you a description of what view you're in. We're in front perspective. So that's always handy. If we hit 3, we go to right perspective. If we hit 7, we go to top perspective. And if we want to go to the back view, left view, or bottom view, we hit Control as we do our number pad buttons. For example, if we want to go to the back, we hit Control 1, and that takes us to the back, as you can see up here. If we hit Control 3, that takes us to the left, and if we hit Control 7, that takes us to the bottom. So there's a really handy way to keep you oriented in the space. And say you also, you lose your spot and you're having trouble orbiting around your object or finding it. With the object selected, you hit period on your number pad, and that'll snap it right to the object. It's really handy if you're having trouble navigating. And it just recenters where your orbit is. The last function we'll quickly take a look at is if we hit 5 on the number pad. What that does is it toggles your view mode between perspective and orthographic viewport. Now, what the difference between those is, in orthographic, your entire view becomes a 2D image. And what that means is there is no perspective, there is no vanishing point. As you can see, our grid floor does not converge if I were to toggle back to perspective. So if you have a bunch of objects lined up, they'll never look any bigger or smaller relative to each other due to distance, as they would in perspective. So if I zoom right in on the sphere, the polyhedron over here, or the tetrahedron over there doesn't look as big as the sphere, but if we zoom out, they're relatively the same size. But a handy tip for using orthographic is that if you're modeling something from an image and you need to get the contours exactly, you go to orthographic and your perspective is nullified, and you can more accurately copy the model you are referencing. But for most cases, you want to stay in perspective just so you can get a good idea of what your shape looks like and how it'll render. But for that, that is about all we are going to cover today. So, and with that, we will finish up our Blender tutorial. I hope this introduction wasn't scary at all, and I hope you have gotten a little bit comfortable with looking at the interface. We'll continue to explore the interface and its functions in future tutorials, and with that, this is Keith Morgan for TechTyro, signing off.